It was just supposed to be another ordinary night out, a chance to enjoy a peaceful meal, maybe share a laugh or two with friends. But for one man, what started as a simple dinner at a local restaurant would quickly spiral into a night he'd never forget. A night where humiliation and disrespect would turn into something far more shocking. What happened to him that evening was nothing short of a wake-up call for both him and everyone who witnessed it. But how did it all unfold? It began when he walked through the restaurant doors, eager to enjoy some time alone and unwind after a long week. The atmosphere was warm, the scent of freshly cooked food filling the air, and the hum of conversations in the background. But as he made his way to an empty table, something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it at first. The looks, the whispers, the way some of the staff seemed to avoid eye contact, it was subtle but undeniable. The waiter approached him, a young man who barely made eye contact, and as he handed over the menu, his tone was colder than it should have been. No pleasantries, no smile, just a quick "Are you ready to order?" It didn't sit well, but he brushed it off. He'd experienced worse, and maybe it was just a rough night for the staff. But things quickly escalated when his order came. A simple mistake at first: his drink was wrong. Small error, no big deal. Yet, as he politely pointed out the issue, the waiter's response was not what he expected. The waiter seemed annoyed, his words sharp and dismissive. "You're lucky we even serve you here," he muttered under his breath. The comment was almost inaudible, but it cut deep. And before he could respond, the waiter had already turned on his heel and walked away, leaving him in stunned silence. He sat there, processing what had just happened, unsure if he'd misunderstood. But deep down, he knew he hadn't. This was not just a simple mistake. This was something more. What followed next was even worse. As he tried to get the attention of the restaurant manager, hoping for some resolution, things only got more uncomfortable. The manager, instead of offering any kind of apology or solution, sided with the staff. He seemed disinterested, almost like he was pretending nothing had happened. It was clear that something was very wrong with the way he was being treated. It wasn't just poor service. It was as if he didn't belong there at all. The feeling of being humiliated, of being made to feel small and unimportant, was overwhelming. But what happened next would leave everyone in the restaurant stunned. The man, calm but resolute, decided he wasn't going to let this pass. What he did in retaliation was something that no one could have predicted. Something that would turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. But just as the tension in the restaurant reached its peak, the man's response was swift and surprising. What happened next left the manager and staff scrambling, not knowing how to handle the situation. They had no idea that their careless actions would lead to this kind of consequence. As the man stood up to leave, he didn't just walk away quietly. His actions, though calculated, sent a powerful message. A message that would forever change the way the staff at that restaurant saw their customers. But what did he do exactly? How did he turn the situation around? You'll have to wait to find out, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to see how one man's moment of humiliation became the perfect opportunity for revenge, and how it all unfolded in a way that no one could have predicted. The restaurant may have thought they were in control, but they were about to learn a hard lesson in respect. What came next? Well, that's a story for another time. The man left the restaurant that night with a fire in his gut. It wasn't just the insult that had stung, it was the way everyone in that restaurant had treated him like he didn't matter. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the sting of racial bias, but it was the first time in a while that it had been so blatant. The way the staff had dismissed him, the way the manager had ignored him, and the look in their eyes told him everything he needed to know: he wasn't welcome. Not here. Not anywhere that saw him as other. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the chilly night air hit him like a slap. But it didn't feel as cold as the treatment he'd just received. His mind raced. Could he let this slide? Could he just forget about it and move on like everyone else in that restaurant expected him to? No. He couldn't. Not when people like that were out there, thinking they could treat him like he was nothing. He wasn't the type to cause trouble. Never had been. But something inside him shifted. It was as if all the years of being overlooked, disrespected, and treated unfairly had finally built up to this point. He had been patient for so long, but tonight something cracked. Still, he wasn't sure exactly what he was going to do. His initial impulse was to walk away, to forget about it, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated like that, everyone who had been made to feel small for no reason other than the color of their skin. The next few days were a blur. He kept going over the night in his mind, piecing together everything that had happened, trying to figure out what, if anything, he could do to make a difference. He researched the restaurant, the staff, the management. He didn't want to make a rash decision. He needed to know exactly who he was dealing with. The more he dug, the more unsettling the picture became. It wasn't just a bad night or a few rude individuals. This restaurant had a history. The reviews online were filled with complaints about poor service, especially toward people of color. Complaints about dismissive staff, about disrespectful behavior, and about managers who either didn't care or were complicit. He wasn't the first person to feel this way. That realization made him more determined. But what could he do? What could he say that would make a difference? The thought of confronting them again filled him with a sense of dread, but also resolve. If he was going to make a stand, he needed to do it in a way that would leave a lasting impression. He didn't want to just walk in, demand an apology, and leave. He wanted to make sure that restaurant never treated anyone the way they had treated him that night. Ever again. His first thought was to call the restaurant, maybe talk to the manager, but he quickly dismissed the idea. The manager hadn't listened to him before, why would he now? No, he needed to go straight to the source. He needed something bigger than a phone call. He needed a plan. Something calculated. Something that would get their attention. He spent hours in his apartment, thinking, plotting, and weighing his options. It wasn't just about getting back at them, it was about making a statement. He wasn't sure what form that statement would take, but he knew it had to hit hard. He couldn't just be another person who walked away, their dignity shattered. If he was going to do this, it had to be impactful. It had to make them realize that they couldn't get away with this kind of behavior. Not anymore. The days passed, and he watched the restaurant closely. He observed how the staff interacted with other customers. He took notes on everything, trying to find a pattern, a weak spot. There had to be something, some way in. And then, one evening, as he sat in a nearby cafe, a realization hit him. He didn't have to go in alone. He could gather people who had been hurt by this restaurant, people who had stories to tell. Together, they could make an impact. He reached out to others who had been treated like he had. It didn't take long before he had a small group of people who were willing to help him. They all had stories of humiliation, of being ignored or treated unfairly. Some of them were regular customers at the restaurant, others had been there just once. But all of them shared the same frustration, the feeling of being dismissed simply because of who they were. As he spoke to them, he realized the power of what they could do. They didn't have to confront the staff directly. They could use the power of social media, the voice of the community, to make their stand. Word of mouth was powerful, but when it went viral, it became unstoppable. What if they could expose the restaurant for what it truly was? What if they could shine a light on the way the staff treated certain customers? They started planning. The group would visit the restaurant at different times, creating a wave of attention. They would take pictures, record videos, and share their experiences online. But they had to be careful. They couldn't just barge in and make a scene. They had to be strategic, calculated. Every move had to be planned to perfection. The group continued to meet, organizing their efforts. They made sure to be discreet, to keep their intentions hidden from the restaurant's management. They knew that the restaurant would be on alert if they suspected anything, so they kept their movements quiet. But the plan was slowly taking shape, and they could feel the momentum building. Meanwhile, the man couldn't help but think back to that night, the way he had been made to feel like he was invisible. The hurt, the anger, it all bubbled up again as he recalled the faces of the staff, the indifference in the manager's eyes. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the principle. About standing up for what was right. About showing that no one should ever be made to feel less than. He knew the stakes were high. If they didn't do this right, it could backfire. But the thought of letting it go, of leaving things as they were, was unbearable. This wasn't just his fight, it was for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't belong. And so, the plan continued to unfold. The group grew more confident, more determined. But they also grew anxious. They knew that what they were about to do wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. And justice, as they knew all too well, was not always easy to achieve. As the day of action drew nearer, the man couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was going to happen. Something big. Something that would change everything. But what that would be, he didn't know. All he could do was wait, and when the time came, take the step that would make them all pay attention. But for now, the tension was thick. The clock was ticking, and the stage was set. Would the restaurant finally learn their lesson? Or would they try to sweep it all under the rug, just as they had done before? No one knew what the outcome would be. But one thing was certain, the man wasn't going to let them forget his name. Not ever again. As the days wore on, the man's resolve only grew stronger. Each time he passed the restaurant, each time he thought about what had happened, a surge of anger flooded his chest. But there was also something deeper, something more calculating. The idea of revenge had started to evolve into something more powerful, a chance to expose the truth. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the people who'd been dismissed and disrespected by the same system, the same attitudes that had nearly destroyed his evening. The group continued to meet in secret, planning their moves carefully. They spent hours discussing the best ways to expose the restaurant's culture, its staff's attitudes, and its management's indifference. They didn't just want to hurt the business, they wanted to make a statement, to make sure that no one else would walk in and face the same treatment. One of the members of the group, a woman who'd been a regular customer at the restaurant, spoke up one day, her voice tinged with emotion. She'd been treated similarly to the man. She told them about the many times she'd been ignored or given subpar service. Her friends had always brushed it off as just bad luck, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. She had felt the stares, the cold treatment, but she had never done anything about it. She had thought of herself as weak, as someone who didn't belong in a fight like this. But now, she was ready to stand with the man. Her words hit everyone in the room. It wasn't just his humiliation, it was theirs too. As they talked more about their plan, the reality of what they were about to do set in. The stakes were high. They couldn't just march into the restaurant and start filming. That would only make things worse. They needed evidence, something concrete that couldn't be ignored. They decided that each person in the group would gather their own experiences, their own footage. They would visit the restaurant separately, try to capture interactions that told the story of how people like them were treated. But the risks of the plan were clear. What if the restaurant figured them out? What if they retaliated? What if they tried to silence them before the story got out? Everyone knew that standing up against an establishment like this could have consequences. If the staff suspected something, they could make life difficult for the group, or worse, try to discredit them. Everyone's fears were palpable, but it wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about taking a stand, about making sure that those who had been treated unjustly had a voice. As the days passed, the group's efforts began to take shape. One by one, they entered the restaurant, each with a secret purpose. The man arrived one evening, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped through the door. This time, he was a silent observer, his camera phone discreetly recording. He couldn't let them see what he was doing, not yet. As he sat down at a table near the back, he noticed the same faces from that night. The waiter who had been so dismissive was there, looking as uninterested as ever. The manager, however, was nowhere to be seen. The waiter came over to take his order, but this time, the man was ready. He asked for something simple, something that would likely go unnoticed. The interaction was polite enough, but there was an edge to the waiter's tone. As he turned to leave, the man caught a glimpse of his face, and there it was again, the same coldness he'd felt that night. The waiter didn't just see him as a customer, he saw him as someone beneath him. It was the same look that had burned into his memory, but this time, he was ready to expose it. He didn't respond to the waiter's behavior. He didn't want to make a scene. But as he sat there, watching the waiter move to the next table, he began to see things more clearly. This wasn't just about him. It was about a system. A culture within this restaurant that allowed people like him to be treated as less than. It wasn't just one person, one incident. It was ingrained, built into the way things were done. That realization hit him hard. Back at the group's secret meetings, the tension was growing. They had all been in the restaurant, each having their own encounters, but the evidence was still incomplete. The footage was not as damning as they'd hoped. No one had caught anything clear enough to truly make a statement. They couldn't just post half-baked videos. The stakes were too high. They needed something solid, something that would make the truth undeniable. Then, as the days passed, an unexpected turn occurred. One of the group members, a quiet, observant man who had been gathering information online, came across something that made everyone stop and listen. The manager of the restaurant, it turned out, had a history. He had worked at several other businesses before, and at each one, there were whispers of the same behavior. Employees had left, customers had complained, and no one seemed to address it. This wasn't just a problem at this restaurant. It was a pattern. The group's suspicions were confirmed. The manager wasn't just a random bad apple, he was part of a much larger issue. This discovery changed everything. They now had the evidence they needed, something that linked the behavior in this restaurant to other places, other businesses with similar complaints. It wasn't just one location's issue, it was something far bigger, and they had the proof. But with this new information came even more questions. How far did the problem go? How many other places had the same culture? How many other people had been affected? The group realized they weren't just exposing this one restaurant anymore, they were uncovering a pattern that spanned much wider than they'd anticipated. Still, they had to move cautiously. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how dangerous their actions could be. They couldn't just release everything at once. They needed a plan, a way to get the public's attention without being discredited. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. They couldn't afford to back down. The tension between them grew as they debated what to do next. Some argued they should strike immediately, release the footage and expose the manager for what he was. Others wanted to dig deeper, to find even more evidence before going public. The clock was ticking, but each step forward felt heavier than the last. Each move felt like a gamble. And then, the man began to question himself. Was this really the right thing to do? Was he doing it for the right reasons? He had wanted justice, yes, but now, it felt like something more. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here. Was it truly about revenge, or was it about something else, something deeper, something that went beyond just him and this restaurant? In the end, the decision wasn't easy. But they knew one thing for sure, they couldn't back down now. The truth was out there, and they were the ones who had to bring it to light. But would they be ready for the consequences? Would they be able to handle the storm they were about to unleash? No one knew, not yet. But they were about to find out. The days leading up to their final move were a whirlwind of preparation, strategy, and nervous anticipation. Each member of the group knew that what they were about to do could change everything, but the weight of their actions felt heavier with every passing hour. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke the air out of the room during their meetings. They had the evidence they needed, but now they had to decide how to present it. Every detail mattered. One misstep could ruin everything. They had agreed on a plan. It was simple, but it wasn't without its risks. They would release a video montage that exposed the behavior of the staff, the manager's disregard for complaints, and the overall toxic culture that had been allowed to flourish at the restaurant. Alongside the footage, they would include the history of the manager's past businesses, his previous employment records that showed similar complaints from other places. The story would be undeniable, and they hoped the public's outrage would be enough to force the restaurant to make real changes. But none of them could ignore the nagging feeling in the back of their minds: what if it didn't work? What if the restaurant fought back harder than they expected? They decided to post everything in a coordinated release: the video, the documents, the history of the manager, all of it. It would happen at the same time, across social media platforms. The group had grown more organized over the last few weeks, building an online presence that was small but dedicated. They knew their story would spread quickly, but would it be enough? Would the public rally behind them, or would they become targets? The night before the release, the man couldn't sleep. He lay awake, replaying every decision they had made, every risk they had taken. The thought of how this would unfold was almost unbearable. He wasn't afraid of the restaurant or the manager, but there was something deeper gnawing at him. What would happen to him and his friends once the video went live? The internet could be a powerful tool for change, but it could also be a weapon, something that could easily be turned against them. Could they handle the fallout? Would they be able to protect themselves if things turned violent, or even illegal? The group met one last time before the release. The mood was quieter than usual, everyone more focused, less talkative. There was nothing more to discuss, just the final touches on the plan. They all knew that tomorrow would be a turning point in their lives, no matter what happened. As they finalized everything, the man felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his peace, for the dignity he had been robbed of, and for the countless others who had been pushed aside without a voice. The clock ticked closer to the time they had set for the release. Each passing minute made it feel like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He double-checked everything one last time, running through the details in his mind. His phone buzzed with messages of support from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Some of them had shared their own stories of mistreatment at the same restaurant, or similar ones. The message was clear: he wasn't alone. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had been made to feel invisible. When the time finally arrived, the group went quiet. They all sat in front of their computers and phones, waiting for the signal to release the information. There was a moment of stillness, a brief pause before the storm. And then, with a single click, the video was live. The footage began to spread instantly, making its way across social media, as people shared it with friends and family. The story hit hard. The manager's history, the dismissive staff, the callous treatment, it was all there, laid bare for the world to see. At first, there was silence. The group stared at their screens, waiting for the inevitable. Would the restaurant retaliate? Would the manager fight back? But then, as the hours passed, the responses started flooding in. People were outraged. Comments flooded in from people who had eaten at the restaurant, some of whom had their own horror stories to share. They were angry, they were disgusted, but most importantly, they were listening. But amidst the support came the backlash. The restaurant's social media pages were bombarded with angry comments, and the manager quickly went on the defensive. He posted a response claiming that the video had been taken out of context, that the staff had been unfairly treated, and that the accusations were false. The restaurant tried to paint themselves as victims, claiming the story had been manipulated. It was a predictable move, but it only fueled the fire. The public wasn't buying it. The next few days were a blur of online arguments, media attention, and phone calls. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the restaurant was under siege. The restaurant's reputation was on the line, and it was clear that they were scrambling to save face. The manager's attempts to downplay the accusations only made things worse. Customers began posting their own experiences, confirming the group's claims, and soon the restaurant was being flooded with negative reviews. The pressure was mounting. But as the situation escalated, so did the tension. The group had never expected things to go this far, this fast. It was like a powder keg, and no one knew when it would explode. The restaurant wasn't going to go down without a fight. Behind the scenes, they were working on damage control, calling in lawyers, and planning their next steps. The man knew this wouldn't be over quickly. This was just the beginning, and it was becoming clear that the restaurant wouldn't let go of their power easily. As the days dragged on, the group found themselves in a dangerous position. The threats started to pour in. Anonymous messages, angry calls, and social media attacks from people who didn't know the full story. Some people believed the restaurant's side, and they made sure the group knew it. The man began to realize that they weren't just fighting a restaurant, they were fighting a culture, an entire system that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. And now, it was getting personal. The group's phone lines lit up. One of them had received an ominous message, warning them to take the video down before it was too late. The tension reached a boiling point. They had exposed something bigger than they had anticipated, and the repercussions were starting to set in. The man knew that the endgame was coming, but would they make it through the storm, or would the restaurant turn the tables on them? The final moments were approaching, and the uncertainty of what would happen next hung in the air. The question was no longer just about what would happen to the restaurant, but what would happen to them, to their lives, after the world saw the truth. The days following the video's release were tense and chaotic. Every move the group made felt like it was being watched. They had expected some backlash, but nothing prepared them for what was coming next. The restaurant, desperate to regain control, had begun to take drastic measures. They were no longer just defending themselves, they were retaliating. And they weren't doing it quietly. One evening, as the man was sitting at home, scrolling through the comments and messages that had flooded in since the video went viral, he received a message. At first, it looked like another random threat, something he'd become accustomed to by now. But this one felt different. It was a screenshot of his personal address. No words, just the image. His heart dropped as he stared at it. He wasn't sure who had sent it, but the message was clear. They knew who he was, where he lived. His hands shook as he read the text that followed. "You've made a huge mistake. We don't take threats like yours lightly. This will end badly for you." It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. And it came at a time when the group was already on edge. They had anticipated some negative feedback, maybe even some legal action, but this was something else entirely. This was personal. He wasn't just fighting a corrupt restaurant anymore, he was fighting a system that would stop at nothing to protect its interests. He immediately called the others. They had all been dealing with increasing pressure, but this was a level none of them had expected. One of the members of the group, the one who had first connected the dots about the manager's history, was particularly shaken. She had received similar messages, and so had a few others. But this was more than just online harassment. It felt like the restaurant was preparing to escalate things beyond what they had anticipated. After a quick meeting, the group realized that they had underestimated the extent to which restaurants' management was willing to go to protect themselves. They had assumed it was just a matter of public image controlling the narrative, fighting back against negative reviews. But now it was clear they were dealing with an enemy who was willing to go to any lengths, including intimidation and threats, to silence them. This wasn't just about saving a business anymore, it was about power, control, and reputation. The next day, the group received another bombshell. A leak had surfaced, a document detailing the restaurant's connections to a local politician. It wasn't just a random bit of gossip, this was something much more serious. The politician had helped the restaurant secure permits, get preferential treatment in zoning disputes, and avoid investigations into some of their more questionable business practices. The leak had come from someone within the restaurant's circle, and it added a new layer to the conflict. Now the group was up against not just a powerful restaurant, but a politician with a lot of influence. The group scrambled to process this new information. The stakes had been raised higher than they could have ever imagined. They weren't just taking on a corrupt restaurant, they were taking on a system. The restaurant had connections, power, and resources that could crush them if they weren't careful. But now, there was a new question: who could they trust? How deep did the corruption go? With the leak came new risks. The politicians' involvement was a game changer. They realized they had to be even more cautious, or they risked not only their safety but their ability to bring any change at all. The man couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something much bigger than they had ever imagined, a tangled web of power and influence that was far beyond just a simple case of mistreatment in a restaurant. Despite the fear gnawing at him, the man knew they couldn't back down now. They had come this far, and the truth needed to come out. But with this new twist, they had to decide whether they were willing to push forward into an even more dangerous territory. The weight of the decision pressed on his chest. This wasn't just about exposing one bad restaurant anymore, it was about taking on a whole network of corruption. And if they weren't careful, the very people they were trying to expose could use that power to destroy them before they ever had a chance to finish what they started. The group convened once again, tensions high as they debated their next move. They now had a decision to make: continue the fight and risk it all, or step back and let the corruption remain hidden in the shadows. But as they discussed their options, a sudden realization hit them. There was no way to stop now. Too many people had come forward, too many voices were starting to be heard. They had opened Pandora's box, and there was no way to close it now. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. And just as the group made the decision to press forward, something else happened. The manager, desperate to control the narrative, made a move that no one could have predicted. He reached out to the media with a twist on the story. He painted the group as dangerous, unstable individuals who had been harassing the restaurant, spreading lies in an attempt to ruin a reputable business. He accused them of orchestrating a smear campaign, turning the whole narrative upside down. Suddenly, they weren't the ones standing up for justice, they were the ones being portrayed as villains. The man watched the media storm unfold, and for the first time, he felt like the ground beneath him was slipping away. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It wasn't even about the politician. It was about the story, the perception of it all. Would the public see them as heroes, or would they fall into the trap that had been set for them? The restaurant's response had turned everything on its head, and now, they had to fight not only for the truth but for their own reputations. The group had just stepped into a whole new level of danger. They weren't just fighting a powerful restaurant, they were fighting for their own survival in a battle that had become much bigger and much more complicated than they had ever imagined. With every move they made, the stakes grew higher, and the risk of losing everything became more real. Now, they had to decide: would they back down, or would they push even further into the unknown? The battle was about to get even darker. The tension had reached its breaking point. With each passing day, the battle between the group and the restaurant escalated, but the real fight had just begun. The manager's media campaign to paint the group as troublemakers seemed to gain traction, and the public's perception was beginning to shift. The group had to act fast before their reputation and everything they had fought for was destroyed. They had one final card to play, one move that could expose everything and push the truth to the forefront once and for all. But this was their last chance. It wasn't just about the video anymore, or even the leaks. It was about taking control of the narrative, about making sure the restaurant's lies couldn't stand any longer. The man sat in front of his laptop, staring at the email in front of him. It was the culmination of everything they had been working toward, an anonymous tip from within the restaurant, someone who had grown disgusted with the way the manager had been running things. The tip came with photos, receipts, and even recorded conversations, all pointing to the restaurant's illegal practices and shady connections with the local politician. It was all there, solid evidence that could bring everything crashing down. They were running out of time. The restaurant had already started to turn the tide of public opinion, using its influence to control the narrative. The group knew that releasing this final set of evidence was their only shot at stopping the manipulation, and they had to do it before the manager and his allies could cover it up. The plan was set. The final evidence would be released to the media at the same time they posted their last, most powerful video. It would show the true scope of the corruption, how deep it ran, and just how far the restaurant was willing to go to protect its empire. This was it. The stakes had never been higher. As the group prepared for the release, they couldn't ignore the fear that had started to creep in. What if it wasn't enough? What if the restaurant had already buried the story too deeply? What if their actions only made things worse for them? But the man knew one thing: they couldn't back down. They had come too far to stop now. The countdown began, and they watched as their evidence slowly made its way into the hands of reporters, social media influencers, and news outlets. The reactions were swift: first shock, then outrage. People started to connect the dots. The photos of the manager's secret meetings, the recorded calls, the bribes that had been paid, it was all laid bare, too much for even the restaurant to deny. But just when the group thought victory was within reach, something unexpected happened. The manager, cornered and desperate, made one final play. He publicly revealed that he had been blackmailed by someone in the group. The twist was unbelievable. He claimed that the group had coerced him into taking part in the corruption, threatening to release the incriminating footage unless he complied. The man's heart sank as he watched the statement unfold across the media. The restaurant had turned the tables again, painting him and his friends as criminals. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, a way to discredit everything they had worked for. The public's sympathy now shifted from the group to the manager. People began to question whether the group had truly been acting with noble intentions or if they had been driven by darker motives. Was it really about justice, or had they been seeking revenge? The group was in chaos. The carefully constructed narrative they had built was unraveling before their eyes. They had worked so hard to expose the truth, only to be painted as the villains in this twisted story. The weight of the accusations seemed impossible to shake off, and it felt as though their entire mission had been in vain. But then came a message, an anonymous tip, this time from someone within the restaurant's inner circle. It was the final piece of the puzzle, a recording of the manager admitting to everything, including the blackmail claims, in a private conversation with his colleagues. The manager had been lying all along, and the truth had been there all along. This recording would expose him for who he truly was, and there was no way to deny it. The group quickly released the recording, and within hours, the media began to turn again. People were furious not just at the manager, but at the way he had used the public's trust to manipulate the situation. The restaurant's reputation, already damaged, was now in tatters. The politician's connections were scrutinized, and public pressure began mounting for both the restaurant and the politician to face legal consequences. But just as the group thought they were finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, a new, even darker twist came to light. A final anonymous post appeared online, one that no one saw coming. It claimed that the manager had not acted alone in orchestrating the corruption. There was someone higher up, someone with even more power, who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The name in the post wasn't a politician, but someone within the highest echelons of local law enforcement, someone who had used their position to shield the restaurant from investigation for years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the entire community, and the group found themselves back at square one. What they thought had been a battle against one corrupt restaurant was now a war against an entire system, a system of corruption that reached far beyond what they had ever imagined. The man sat back, the weight of everything that had transpired settling on him. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He knew what needed to be done. They had exposed the truth, but now they had to finish what they started. The story was far from over. The real enemy was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until the entire network of corruption was brought down. As the group prepared to face the next battle, they understood one thing: their victory would never come easily. The system they were up against was bigger, more powerful, and more dangerous than they had ever realized. But the truth had already been unleashed. And no matter how many twists and turns lay ahead, they were determined to see it through to the end. The final showdown was coming. And this time, they would be ready. The pressure was unlike anything the group had experienced before. The moment the final post went viral, everything shifted. It wasn't just about a corrupt restaurant anymore, it was about uncovering a network of corruption so deep that it threatened the very foundation of their community. Now, they were not only exposing the manager's lies but also unraveling the truth about local law enforcement and powerful figures who had operated with impunity for years. But with this new information came greater risks. As they began their investigation into the law enforcement connection, they realized the depth of the conspiracy was more extensive than they had anticipated. The group knew they had to be cautious. They were already walking a tightrope between being seen as heroes and being demonized as troublemakers, but now the stakes were even higher. They couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who had been on their side. The world they had entered was far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, and the threat of retaliation loomed over them at all times. Despite the mounting fear and uncertainty, the man and his friends refused to back down. They had started this fight to expose the truth, and they were determined to see it through, no matter the cost. They knew the risks, but they also knew the importance of bringing these corrupt systems to light. They began gathering more evidence, piecing together everything they had learned so far, and preparing for the next step. For weeks, the group worked tirelessly, preparing a report that would blow the lid off the whole operation. They knew they needed to present the evidence in a way that left no room for denial. The final report would detail the restaurant's illegal practices, the manager's involvement, and most importantly, the law enforcement officers who had been covering for them. The stakes were high, but the group felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the community, for justice, and for those who had been wronged. As the final report was prepared for release, the group decided to go public with their findings in a live-streamed press conference. They knew this would be the moment of truth. This would be their opportunity to share everything they had uncovered, to ensure that the evidence couldn't be ignored. But just as they were about to finalize their plans, the unthinkable happened. The restaurant's manager, in a last-ditch effort to maintain control, launched a full-scale smear campaign against the group. He hired a public relations firm to discredit their credibility, accusing them of fabricating evidence, twisting the truth, and spreading lies. The campaign was ruthless. False accusations, doctored images, and manipulated video clips were circulated across social media platforms. The group's reputation was once again under attack, and this time, the media was eating it up. As the public's perception of the group began to shift, the man felt a crushing sense of betrayal. It seemed as though no matter how much evidence they had, no matter how many people came forward to support them, the system was stacked against them. The manager's manipulation of the media had created a powerful narrative, and it was almost impossible to break through. But the group wasn't giving up. They had come too far to let this be the end of the story. They knew that the battle for truth wasn't over, it had only just begun. They quickly realized that they needed to take their fight beyond social media, beyond the court of public opinion. They needed to make sure the legal system took notice of the overwhelming evidence they had gathered. The group decided to take the case to court. It was a risky move. The manager and his allies had deep pockets, and the power they wielded seemed unshakable. But they knew that the truth was on their side, and they couldn't let fear stop them from pursuing justice. They hired the best legal team they could afford, and together, they began building their case. As the trial began, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The group had their evidence, but so did the restaurant. The manager's defense was relentless. He denied everything, insisted that the group was simply trying to ruin his life, and painted himself as the victim of a smear campaign. His lawyer played the emotional card, framing the case as an attack on a hard-working businessman who had been unfairly targeted. The jury listened intently, and for a moment, it seemed as though the group might lose everything. But the group's legal team was prepared. They methodically dismantled the manager's defense, piece by piece. The truth was undeniable. The recordings, the photos, the documents, all pointed to one thing: the restaurant had been engaging in illegal activities, and the manager had been at the center of it all. And when the final bombshell was dropped, the recording of the manager admitting to everything, including the cover-up with law enforcement, the case began to turn in the group's favor. The courtroom went silent as the recording played, exposing the manager's lies in real time. The jury could no longer ignore the truth. The walls of corruption that had been protecting the restaurant began to crumble. The group had done it. They had fought back and won. In the end, the manager was convicted, and the restaurant's shady dealings were exposed for all to see. The politician who had been involved also faced scrutiny, though his involvement would take longer to unravel. The restaurant, once a powerful institution in the community, was forced to shut down, and the public was left to reckon with the reality of what had been hidden for so long. The group's victory was bittersweet. They had succeeded in bringing justice, but the cost had been high. Their reputations had been dragged through the mud, their lives turned upside down. But as they watched the manager led away in handcuffs, they knew it had been worth it. They had taken on a powerful system and won, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, truth and justice could prevail. As the dust settled and life slowly returned to normal, the man and his friends reflected on everything they had been through. They had learned a lot about themselves, about each other, and about the systems that governed their lives. They had seen firsthand how power and corruption could warp a community, and how the fight for justice was never as simple as it seemed. But they had also learned that the truth, no matter how hard it is to uncover, is worth fighting for. The final twist came in the aftermath of the trial. In the weeks following the trial, the group received an anonymous tip, a name, a connection, and a new lead that tied the law enforcement corruption to an even higher level of government. The story wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The man sat back, staring at the tip in his inbox. It was clear that the battle was far from won. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. They had shown that the truth could be uncovered, that the powerful could be held accountable. And even though there was still much more to be done, he knew that as long as they had the courage to keep fighting, the truth would continue to emerge. And so, with the story far from over, they made a decision. The fight wasn't just about one restaurant, one corrupt manager, or even one politician. It was about something bigger. It was about creating a world where justice could prevail, no matter who was in power. The battle was far from finished, but now, with the weight of their victory behind them, they were ready to face whatever came next. As the credits rolled on their final video, the group knew one thing for certain: they would never stop fighting for the truth. Because in the end, that was all that mattered. And in that fight, they had found not just justice, but their own strength.